Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Elliot Gerson from the Aspen Institute, and I am delighted to welcome all of you here today. We are thrilled to be continuing our now long-standing relationship with Intel, looking at issues related to innovation. We had a remarkable series of programs last year looking at innovation generally, and they were so successful and made such an impact that Intel talked to us about continuing with a focus this year, drilling down even more deeply in a particular area where innovation is fundamental, and that, of course, is education. This is the second in a series of conversations like this. The first one, some of you I know were here with Arnie Duncan. And this one is on an incredibly timely and important topic relating to technology, and I think specifically questions about why technology has not yet had the profound effect on education that I think many of us thought it would and still hope that it will. I'm simply going to now recognize Carlos Contreras, our good friend from Intel, who has a few words, and then I will introduce the moderator for today's panel. Carlos?
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon. I want to thank Aspen for hosting the luncheon, PBS NewsHour for the facilitation. Appreciate it. For us, as it was mentioned, this is really a continuation of the conversation that we have started. We're very concerned about our students, our country, in terms of our ability to compete internationally. We think that this is a topic where we can regain our edge, our technology edge, and our competitive edge. And as a company, I'm not sure if you guys know, I mean, our R&D budget is somewhere around $6 billion. National Science Foundation is about $6.7 billion, so we're pretty close to the NSF. And then that money gets translated into a product. So 80% of our revenues that are produced in the last quarter of the year are for products that didn't exist at the beginning of the year. So we really believe in the power of innovation and the power of investment and the power of innovation. We also, on the education front, we have, over the last 10 years, we've invested about $100 million a year. It's about $1 billion. With the topic of today, we've trained 8 million teachers on how to use technology in the classroom, and I think one of the topics that's going to come up today is not really about the technology. It's just a tool. It's about how that technology is used. And for us, that's been the biggest investment, is in investing in our teachers, because we feel that that is where we get the highest return for our investment. So with that, I'd like to, I know these conversations are really fun, very interactive, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all the perspectives and the viewpoints that you guys have to share. And I'm sure this is not a shy group from previous experiences. So thank you.
Thank you again, Carlos. And let me just mention one other influence that Intel had. The series we did last year on innovation were so successful, actually, that we were asked, the Institute was asked to try to do something similar in Abu Dhabi, where actually Walter and I just came back from Abu Dhabi a couple of days ago, really directly inspired by our conversations with Intel last year. So really, Intel's contribution here is not just having an effect domestically, but really internationally, with lots of people looking at what are the critical ingredients to make sure that societies remain as creative and entrepreneurial as possible. Carlos mentioned that we do have another very important partner in this, and it is PBS NewsHour. We enjoy always working with them, and they're tremendous professionals, and we're particularly delighted to have Jeffrey Brown here today, who's been a senior correspondent, arts correspondent, and producer. And it will be his pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel and to get the conversation rolling, and I hope that as many of you as possible will jump in as well. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you, Carlos. And on behalf of Jim and all of us at NewsHour, very happy to participate in this. I've done a number of things at Aspen, always enjoy it. It's always interesting, so I'm happy to be back here again. I'm going to play moderator here, but I would like to stay as much out of this as possible, and because we have 3 wonderful guests here. And what's even more interesting to me, I mean, because every night on the NewsHour, of course, I have a panel, but I don't have a group of live people around me like this. So it's nice to see real faces. It's even nicer to know that I'm looking at the list here, and it's awfully impressive, the expertise here and everything, the energy that I hope you can bring to it. So in the interest of just sort of letting you know how this will work, I think what we'll do is talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes or so everybody can introduce themselves, what they do, what they're passionate about, what they're trying to put on the table here. I certainly want to talk a little bit about the barriers that they're all running up against. And then I would really like to open this up to you and make this as conversational as possible. Fair enough? So I will start with Joel Rose. You can read the introductions, of course, so I'm not going to go into the long introductions of everybody. But Joel is the creator and CEO of School of One in New York City. So Joel, why don't you just start with telling us a little bit about School of One. Maybe by way of telling us that, what is the problem that School of One was intended to deal with or to overcome?
Thanks, and thank you all for having me here. School of One is built on the premise that in many ways the job that we ask teachers to do every day is too hard. That we have this model that assumes, for example, on the first day of 5th grade, all the students have mastered all the materials in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, and they're ready to learn the entire 5th grade curriculum from beginning to end. And we give them a curriculum to do that. And then on the other hand, they look at the data and they see they have students all over the map, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 7th, 8th grade. And we've never been able to sort of reconcile these two differences. And so what School of One tries to do is say, look, let's for once try to come up with a model, a school model that doesn't assume one teacher, 28 kids in a box. Let's view live teacher-led instruction, the kind of instruction we all think about when we think about what school is, as one way. It may be the best way, but it's certainly not the only way kids can learn. Kids can learn with software. Kids can learn with virtual tutors. Kids can learn in groups from each other with no technology. Kids can learn by themselves with a book. And by integrating these modalities, we call them, into one learning environment, that's what enables personalized learning. So in my former classroom, I remember teaching 5th grade, teaching 27 kids how to add fractions. And there were 7 of them who still didn't know what a fraction was. Happens in every classroom across the country. What does the teacher say? They say, don't worry about it, hang in there, you'll get it next time, the curriculum will spiral back around. But what they're thinking is, I've got to get to chapter 32 by the end of the year, because that's my job as a teacher. And maybe they'll learn it, maybe they won't. Why should those 7 kids be held hostage to the pace of the rest of the class? Why can't they get instruction in what a fraction is in another modality? So what we do in School of One is we have come up with a way to integrate multiple modalities into one learning environment. The sort of quick and dirty is, on one hand, we have all this data about each student, both their particular academic needs and strengths. On the second hand, we have content. We have over 50 different content providers that have given us over 5,000 lessons, some digital lessons, some live lessons, some collaborative lessons. And then we created something called a learning algorithm that basically takes the data, those 2 data sets, and creates a unique schedule for each student each day that we project on monitors around the room, similar to the monitors you see at the airport. Students take an assessment at the end of every day, and then with that data, we're able to create a schedule for the next day. So it's a completely adaptive program that combines the best of both what teachers have to provide as well as what technology can offer us.
Okay, so I started with you so we could start almost in the classroom, and we'll come back to actually what one would see walking into a classroom. Let me get Michael Horn in here, co-author of Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change How the World Learns.
Yes.
You're broadening out a little bit to a kind of theory of online and innovative learning.
Yeah, so currently in my day job, I run a nonprofit think tank called Innosight Institute, and our focus has been exactly what Joel just started with, which is we have this system that was actually built to standardize the way we teach and test, and how do we actually transform this into a student-centric one such that the student's individual needs we're able to customize for those in a very affordable fashion. Right now we do some customization, but it tends to be cost prohibitive. If you educate an individualized learning plan for a special needs student, it would cost you 2 to 3 times on average. If there's a special needs educator in here, they'll quickly attack me and say that it would actually cost far more than that were you to truly individualize for all the needs. We just can't do it. And so we focused on how do you take the technology really as the platform in the form of online learning which is inherently modular. So you can inherently customize for differences. Time is variable, so I can move on once I've mastered a concept. Through Joel's system and others that are out there, you can deliver the experience I need when I need it to get me to where I go. And the mystery, though, was that technology and this sort of movement has been around in lots of sectors. We've had personal computers for 30 years now, and they haven't had that transformation at all. And as we studied it, the answer was that actually schools have operated like any company or any sector has when they've seen a potentially what we call disruptive innovation, which is to cram it into the existing model to sustain what they already do, but not fundamentally turn it on its head and question those assumptions. And so what we've seen is that, just like any disruptive innovation, the biggest impact of online learning, where it can question these assumptions, has been in areas where the school isn't able to offer something today. So credit recovery is a huge one. Students in urban cities right now fail courses, have no way to make up the credits to get back on track to graduate. Huge problem. Online learning has been booming in those sorts of areas. Advanced courses is another one. You could go on and on. The question that we're more concerned with is, while we actually see a lot of online learning growth in the country, 27% of high school students took at least one online course last year, will it actually be transformational, or is it actually going to run right into the system as well and keep a lot of the same assumptions we have at work? And I think that's a big question right now where policy really starts to play a role.
Okay, come back to some of those issues. Let me get Blair Levin in here, the senior fellow at the Aspen Institute now, and was lead author of the National Broadband Plan, so we are broadening even further here.
Right. Let me start by saying I know the least amount about education of anyone in this room. Everything I know about education, I learned from Steve Midgley, who's here and who wrote the education chapter of the Broadband Plan, and is now, fortunately, at the Department of Education working on these issues. And in some ways, I feel like I should just yield the rest of my time to Steve. But I want to talk about it from a broader perspective and how we and the plan, particularly the leadership of the plan, both became interested in particular in this issue, and quite passionate about it by the time we were done. And it goes the following, that a way of thinking about how we thought about the plan was, if you read Peter Drucker, the great business strategist, in the early 90s, he was writing a number of pieces about the importance of knowledge workers, and said that fundamentally what we enjoy in the Western society in terms of GDP and the economics all owes to a revolution in manufacturing that occurred due to Frederick Taylor in the early 1900s. And there was this great miracle about how we improved manufacturing. And that went into a number of places. But that for the next century, it would be all about the knowledge worker. In fact, he went so far as to write that the ability to make the knowledge worker more productive, the fate of Western civilization essentially depended upon it. And what we recognized with the broadband plan is that fundamentally knowledge workers will be working on that platform. That is the method of knowledge exchange. And as we started looking about the task that we were given with the broadband plan should be thought of as twofold. Number one, how do you democratize those tools of knowledge exchange? That makes sure that the right tools are everywhere that they need to be, because the market's not going to do everything. And then you get into some issues of universal service and other things. But also, very importantly, Congress gave us the task of how do you use those tools to improve the way we deliver very important public goods and services. And it turned out that some of the most important areas where knowledge exchange is at the very core, particularly education and healthcare, are the areas that are perhaps the biggest laggards in terms of the actual use of those tools. And why is that? And so a lot of what Steve had to do was try to figure out where are the leverage points for changing that model. There is no doubt that though I have two kids who've graduated college, but also a kid who's a junior in high school, she carries a backpack that has the same 25 pounds of books that I had. And I actually think that some of them are the same books. But there's no doubt that her kids, kids of my other kids, will not be doing that. And obviously, one of the things we were able to see in terms of broadband is the ability of wireless broadband to take videos and other things that are important for education, as well as the price of the devices are all going to go through just this dramatic transformation in the next couple of years. So, but by the year 2015, we will be able to do things that people now are just beginning to wake up to. So I will just leave you with the point, much like the fundamental point that other people have made that I would make as we made it in the book. When we got to electricity, it took 40 years for 50% of the factories actually to adopt electricity. And the early efforts suffered from the same things that Michael just said, which is they had these centralized factories which had to be next to water, and then they had a central shaft driven by that water power, and they were 4 or 5 stories tall. They started to look at electricity and said, we can do it a little bit better, and they were grafting it onto those factories. It wasn't until 1910 or so that people started saying, wait a minute, we don't need to be by the river. We can build horizontal factories because we can distribute the power throughout. And that led to the modern manufacturing. So again, to bring it back, we need that kind of transformation in how we think about education as well. And in terms of these extraordinary tools of knowledge exchange that other people are using, we need to bring them into the classroom, into our kids, into our homes. And there's a lot of good to be had with that.
Well, so Joel, explain to us how you've got a pilot program underway. Explain to us specifically how you're transforming a classroom. What does it look like? What is different for the students and for the teachers?
So if you're Johnny, first period you have science, you go to room 104 with Mrs. Jones, just like every other student does, and then next period you have PE and you go outside. But third period you have math. And for third period, you walk into the math center. So we've knocked down the walls between 3 different classrooms. We created a large open space where you'll be with roughly 100 or so other kids. And in that large space, there may be 8 or 9 different stations. Some stations will be for working with a live teacher. Some stations are for working with a virtual tutor. Some are for learning online with software. Some are for working by yourself. Some are for working collaboratively with different kids. And there's signs above each of the stations, the school's name. There's the Bronx Zoo and the Statue of Liberty and the Brooklyn Room and all of those sorts of spaces. So student walks in and they look up and they see right away these big monitors that look like the monitors you see at the airport. And say, oh, okay, I'm going to the Brooklyn Room first. And then I go to the Brooklyn Room, I log into my computer, I see after a 30-minute lesson on adding fractions, I'm going to go to the Bronx Zoo and work online on adding fractions. And then I'm going to take an online assessment on that skill, on adding fractions, and then that's my math period. Same thing happens tomorrow. They come in, based on how they did on that assessment, we create their schedule for the next day.
So it could be different every day.
It is different every day.
And how are kids taking to that?
They're loving it. I mean, we know one of the biggest reasons students drop out is because they're bored. So they're up, they're working in different modalities. They're getting learning they know is customized to their particular needs. They can track their own progress and move at their own pace, oftentimes more quickly than the teacher might otherwise go. There's a whole sort of motivational game dimension built into what we do, so they're trying to set goals and accomplish those goals. But they know that they're constantly interacting with teachers, and the teachers are helping them to make sure that they're being.
Do the teachers know what they're going to do every day?
They do. They get a schedule every day. Just
But
like
they don't
kids
know.
do.
No, but I mean, they don't know until that day.
They know the night before. So we put out a preliminary schedule to teachers. They can then override it based on their judgment. Then we publish the final schedule. Teacher says, okay, I've got 7 kids coming to me at 9 o'clock to learn adding fractions. At 10 o'clock, I have 7 kids coming to me to learn about area of a circle. And they see, they all have iPads. They see exactly which kids are coming, how many lessons they've had on that particular skill, and where each student is vis-a-vis learning that particular skill.
And how are the teachers accepting that or taking to that?
And we've done, we did 3 programs last summer. The teacher survey results were very, very high. They all want us to come back, and now we're the in-school math program in all 3 schools. The biggest reasons are what they tell us, and look, there's a reason why 40% of teachers today consider themselves disheartened based on the latest survey in EdWeek. Nearly half of all teachers we hire every year are gone 5 years later. This is not a sustainable job. What they've said to us is, number one, you've lowered my class size. Because if you've got students working in different modalities, I'm only working with 7 to 12 kids at a time. And when I'm working with those kids, I know they've all mastered all of the precursor skills for whatever I'm teaching, because that's how the learning algorithm works. You're not learning how to add fractions unless you know what a fraction is. So they can move much more efficiently than they could otherwise in a 25 or 30 kid classroom with students who are all over the map.
So how does what he's describing fit into your concept of a kind of disruptive and then online learning?
Pretty neatly in a lot of respects. A couple thoughts that I think are just important to sort of cap onto what Joel said. One thing I think that was interesting is he never used the word classroom. You said math center, you said learning spaces.
He also said airport.
I won't go there.
Which is a little scary, actually.
But I think not using the word classroom is actually an important thing, because the moment you say classroom, we're back into that layering mode, one teacher, 28 kids concept. And this is a much more open space that defies geographies and jumps around and uses knowledge in the ways that kids do already outside of school. The second thing was the question you asked about teacher attitudes. When you talk to people who are teaching in these online learning environments, they actually say something really interesting, which is, I get to know my children far better than I did when I taught in a regular classroom environment. So this is something that's deeply personal and deeply hands-on, because now their job is very different. It's working in small groups, it's customizing instruction, it's working as a problem solver for whatever the individual problem is, and acting often as a motivator or mentor to keep the child on that plan. It's a very different job, and it's a much more rewarding one that is often the reason teachers got into this in the first place. I think what's different maybe about what Joel's doing in the disruptive innovation vision is where you would start. Joel, I would view School of One as sort of like the space project, this great R&D thing that's going to seed lots of innovations throughout the sector over the next 10 years, a lot of which we can't even imagine today. That's the analogy that I would think of it. Because a lot of the online learning is growing. That's not the issue. The issue is the quality and rethinking the model, and that's what he's really doing.
Well, what kind of barriers do you run into in terms of, if you're asking people to rethink the model, you've got to run up against a lot of different
Yeah, well,
opposition.
right now we pay money based on seat time. So literally, if a child is in the seat, that's how the money comes. We've been measuring the wrong end of the student for some time. A lot of these online learning models.
You know, on the NewsHour every night we have to make sure there's a body and a seat. Usually, that's the first.
That's the first part of it,
First
right?
part of it is before you can talk to somebody, you need the butt in the chair. That's what we like to say. So
And if
it is important.
It's not unimportant, right? But there's a second part of it, which is the student actually learning?
Yes.
And our system is not tied funds to actual learning outcomes. The Florida Virtual School, which is an example in Florida, only receives the bulk of its funding if the student successfully completes the course. Why does that work? Well, because time is variable, so they can hold the outcome constant. And so they pay based on, yes, are they attending and so forth. That's part of it. They get some upfront fee for that, about 10 to 20%. The bulk of it comes only when the student has successfully completed the course. To actually judge all of these innovations by the old metrics really hamstrings it and prevents us from doing a lot of the team teaching things we could do, small group to large group to individual innovations that we might perceive. And a lot of the barriers implicitly and explicitly fall around those sorts of things.
But you can jump in here, Blair, if you want to as well. But do the metrics exist to measure this sort of more personalized approach to education yet, or is this sort of an intuitive at this point that this has got to be better than the backpack full of textbooks that we've all had?
Sure they do. I
They
mean,
do.
the programs we've run, we've had control groups, we've had treatment groups, we've had outside evaluators, we've rigorously measured the results. We're working our way towards a randomized control study, so absolutely. I mean, if you're clear about what it is you're trying to accomplish, and you're innovating towards that particular end, and measuring those outcomes is not particularly hard. It's where it gets funny is if you sort of change the ball on what is it we're trying to accomplish. If we have different perspectives on what it is we want schools to do, that's when the evaluation becomes a little harder.
Blair,
Can I just add, I don't know what works, and I actually suspect that most of the stuff out there doesn't work that well, but here's what I do know, that everywhere else a digital platform is much better at improving itself over time. And that's really what we need to have happen. So if it turns out that the course doesn't work the first year, you figure out the problem, and you start to make it better every year. And we want that constant innovation and that constant improvement. If you have a textbook, you actually don't know whether it works. You don't know whether, we were talking earlier, does chapter 4 work, does chapter 7 work? If you have a digital book and their kids are taking, tests at the end of each chapter and the results are immediately going into a larger computer, and we're looking at this the way Google looks at its data, or great hospitals look at their data, or banks look at their data, and they're just constantly driving improvement. If you have that digital platform, you can do it. If you have an analog platform, you can't.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's an interesting byproduct out of that, which is that in Washington, we've seen a lot of battles over performance pay for teachers and so forth, obviously, particularly in the last year. The interesting thing is in these sorts of models where this has been flipped, the teachers demand performance pay. It's actually the teachers coming to them and saying, this just doesn't make sense unless I'm paid for what I'm actually now have control over. Before, they didn't have that sort of control.
Blair, I'm wondering about, to get us to the sort of barriers that, to all this, the potential here. I mean, when you're working on the National Broadband Plan, we know that there are all kinds of barriers across the board in terms of entrenched players.
Right.
When it comes to education, what do you see? As someone sort of looking from the outside.
Would you mind if I turned it over to Steve?
Sure.
And I don't want to put Steve on the spot, but
Well, let's put him on the spot.
Because, like I said, everything I know I learned from you.
Thanks. Well, I'm happy to edge up to that point. I mean, there are a lot of different components to the entrenched players, because you can look at the entrenchment of the public education system, and you can look at the entrenchment on the vendor side of things. And you have a very strange marketplace where all the money piles up at the beginning of the year on one side of the table and moves across to the other side, right? And it's unlike IBM and Oracle, and where the healthcare that IBM might be receiving is run on an Oracle database. You know, it's a much more diverse network. This starts here, moves here every year without fail. And so when you look at entrenchment, you talk to vendors who say, I want to build this product. This is the right product, but no one will buy that product, so I'm building this other product that I can sell. And then you get innovators who say, I want to buy the product that he's not building, and I can't because he's not building it, right? So you have this impedance mismatch, which is everyone is building for the middle average. And I think that plays right into Michael Horn's thesis, which is if you can break apart into more modular functions to allow the market to be more efficient so that innovators can rather than having to build, I know that you guys have been carving this out of marble, if you could find more modular pieces that would allow you to build this solution more efficiently, then you could potentially move the market much more quickly, because the leading edge innovators can actually find the solutions that they want, and those solutions can grow to fit the larger market. Hopefully that's it.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a critical challenge, because if you look at the textbook players, there's basically three that dominate the market today. In theory, they have the resources such that they could do this modular transformation, but they don't have the business model, because they get paid based on a lump sum for delivering a full textbook. So there's a mismatch right there, and that's a critical problem, and the textbook adoption process feeds that more. And so there's all of these things that feed mass standardization when we need to be moving to mass customization. That's been one of the critical blocks. And I would say to this point, the disruptive innovation players on the online learning side have not at all solved that problem either. They look actually very similar to the textbook players in that they're one monolithic course. There are a few experiments happening similar to School of One. And if you actually look at the corporate training world, you're actually starting to see a lot of innovation there, where places like Sun Microsystems, are actually using social networking to create courses, which has stripped out cost completely from their creation. ROIs of 7,000% basically, with similar results. It's just astounding, because there's a very straightforward driver of we have to do training more efficiently for lower cost, better results, that drives that doesn't exist right now in the education market.
Where are you seeing, I mean, you mentioned there are other experiments around. What kind of institution welcomes it, and what kind doesn't?
That's a great question. I think one where we're going to go back to the accountability. I think that driving for results really does play a large part in this. And I'll differ a little bit. While I agree that some of the quality parts are solved, I do think that Common Core and the assessments, next generation assessments that have come out of funding from the department right now, are a critical part to actually seeing this become a more rational marketplace in terms of this work. And right now, that infrastructure doesn't exist, in my perspective.
I agree with that. I had one more missing link here, which is I think the one that's most easily overlooked, and that is there's just been a lack of imagination here. I mean, by everybody. I mean, by schools, by the private. I mean, across the board. You know, one of the schools we're in, they spend $1,400 a kid on math instruction. 95% of those dollars are spent on teachers in the form of teacher salaries. 5% on curriculum and software. Now, I promise you, 2 years ago, if you said to that principal, good news, I'm going to give you another $1,000 a kid, what would you do? You'd hire more teachers, a little bit of software, and maybe a coach here and there. We have never sort of asked ourselves the question, if you've got $1,400, $800, whatever the number is, what is the most efficient use of these resources to get the best outcomes for kids? And maybe it's 95%, maybe it's 75%, maybe it's a different mix of human capital. Maybe there's fewer senior teachers that you pay more money to because they can have a wider impact. Maybe we think about roles that are focused, maybe you have 3 coaches who do nothing but motivate and support students, but they're not necessarily the pedagogical experts. We'll use technology in different ways. The point is we've never actually framed the question in a way that is around how do we make the best use of our resources. We have been locked into, you know, spend more money, hire more people, reduce class size, and that's sort of the end of our imagination.
But do you see some signs that that's opening up at all?
I hope so. I mean, I hope that we've tried to sort of
But do
push
you
the
see
envelope a little
signs?
bit. They're few and far between. They're few, but I think part of it is that I think that we have to create the conditions for that. That the policy will only take us so far, but we actually have to, I'd argue, launch a number of entrepreneurs and organizations that can sort of take this $1,400 question and say, well, how would I do it? How would I do it? And some may involve tech and some may not, but I think that's where we have to get to if we're really going to figure out what the next
but tell, again, to make it more concrete, tell what conditions had to be in place for you to do what you're doing?
Well, I had to have an idea. I had to have a chancellor sitting 20 feet from me who would read my idea and listen to me.
Okay, chancellor 20 feet away.
And we had to convince somebody to give us some money to try it out.
Somebody to give you money, okay.
And that's basically what we needed.
And the somebody was?
Well, at that time it was Cisco.
Okay. So from the private sector.
That came from the private sector.
Yeah.
And then that sort of snowed. Then we had people see it and they understood it and they got excited about it. We were able to attract a little bit more money and bring on some more capacity, and we could begin to develop some momentum. Now there's still a ton of barriers in front of us, but that's sort of just how these things start. I mean, it's as simple as it may sound.
Blair, you want to jump in with any of the barriers here?
Well, I would agree. I think of it in terms of there are certain sunk costs in terms of facilities in schools, but the real problem is sunk costs. We think about things in a certain way. We generally think about the wrong thing. It's just the nature. I'm a little bit comforted by Winston Churchill's comments that the American people always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And in this area strikes me, I'll just say very quickly, one of the things we were constantly warning against was everyone was asking us, why don't we have a broadband plan that gets us speeds as fast as they have in Korea? Where they, to all, 84% of the Korean population, I think, lives in the Seoul area and high-rise buildings, and they have fiber. Almost no Koreans actually use that for anything that we can figure out has anything to do with economic growth or social justice, but nonetheless, people measure that metric. Here's what Americans don't know, but is far more disturbing to me. Because being behind Korea on fixed wireless to the homes actually isn't that much of a problem. We're behind on wireless, which I think is actually more of an economic problem. But the big thing is they're going to have all digital textbooks by, I think, 2012 or something like that. They've already started. They started several years ago. But nobody in the United States is worried about that. But that is a far bigger thing in terms of their ability to improve the education of their kids than what we have here today.
I'd love to open this up now to people. I've seen heads nodding, sometimes shaking. Yes? Yes. Could you, would you, everyone mind just sort of briefly saying who you are?
I'm Rick Kerwin. I'm a chancellor, but of the University of Maryland system, not of the school system. And I'm also a mathematician, so I was very interested in Joel's description of the math class. Interestingly, Joel, you may know that some of those strategies are beginning to seep into higher education. And in particular, Virginia Tech teaches all of its lower division mathematics courses in exactly the same modality that you are describing. But my question for you was that you described the first class that the students took, and it seemed to be a traditional class. And then they went to PE.
Yeah.
And then they came to math, and they had this incredible experience. And
Yeah.
then what happens the rest of the day? Are you only doing this in math, or are you trying to broaden the application to other disciplines?
So we're starting with math.
I see.
I mean, we sort of felt this was a pretty tricky thing to figure out, and we wanted to narrow the scope of what we were doing and go deeper rather than try to do too much. So there are some transitional pain points through that strategy, like kids are getting 6 out of 7 periods in the traditional way. But we got to start somewhere, and that's just sort of where we chose to start.
We're experimenting with these strategies at the university, at our universities, and we've had a phenomenal success with chemistry. So I know chemistry you don't teach in elementary school, but it does seem that the applications are broader than just math, as I'm sure you would agree.
Can you weigh in on where you have seen any problems, issues, or surprises as you start to?
Well, I think that the problem in higher education, the reason it hasn't moved faster in this area is that despite their reputation of being bastions of liberalism, higher education is one of the most conservative enterprises on the face of the earth, and change is just not impossibly, but very difficult to pull off. And so I think there's been a lot of resistance just because of the tradition-bound nature of higher education. I actually think that the financial crisis has been a catalyst for some change, because it turns out that you can improve learning and actually lower costs with some of these strategies. So you're now starting to see more universities become engaged in looking at some of the strategies that Joel described.
Is cost actually, okay.
Linda Roberts, and I just recently helped work on the new education technology plan, which was being built in, parallel with the broadband plan. We worked very closely with Steve, and in terms of context, this is the third plan I've helped to write. And what is really striking about the conversation so far, and so encouraging to me, is that the focus isn't on the technology at all. It is really the focus is on changing the opportunity for learning and really changing what I would describe as the equation of failure for lots of kids. And I'll give you just one example. What is so striking to me is that when we started to look at online learning for kids, especially for kids and for college students, we were told over and over again, this was in 1994, that the only learners who could benefit from this were the brightest and the most self-motivated and the best. And to hear now that kids who are failing in the traditional system are succeeding, and I assume there's data on that, succeeding in credit recovery means you failed the course, and you've got to fix it somehow. Typically, you used to go to summer school. So I think that notion that you could really serve the entire spectrum of learners in a variety of ways is very, very exciting. And there are examples of really pockets or islands of success. They're in the tech plan. I can send them to you.
But again, to this question of what is it that makes an institution welcome or not welcome these things? What have you seen?
Leaders, I'm thinking about a school superintendent in Michigan who faced with financial problems, couldn't bring on summer school teachers to do credit recovery courses, figured out that he could do it with resources online, and he had fewer teachers in the system, but they were the ones who were responsible for choosing the online resources. And 2/3 A, he could do it with less money, and B, he had a much higher success rate. So, that's an example. Walled Lake is the name of the district. Western Governors University is a really wonderful example of a very focused university that serves mostly rural adults. Most of the students who go there are not your typical high school students at all. So, I mean, not high school, college students. So, what makes it possible? Leadership, vision, as Joel said, quality stuff. You gotta have stuff that really works. And I think the other big point is this notion of continual improvement that Blair is exactly right. We see it in other sectors. We've got to see it in education.
Yeah, this is a big deal, I think. But something implicit was the budget situation that's driving a lot of this. Just to set the perspective even more, 75% of districts are now doing something with online learning. 75%. So that's it. There's momentum in higher education. It's ahead of K-12. 50% of students, roughly, by the end of this year, will have taken at least one online course. So you're seeing some movement. Linda, you said one thing that I think was interesting about the data question, and that's still really hit or miss. Some of what we do a lot of is writing case studies to actually explore where we see some of these disruptive innovations taking root, to understand them better. How did they actually get started? What were the drivers, and what are the good things and bad things? Some of the districts, I've got to tell you, you go and you say, I'll tell you, one of the biggest areas of innovation is dropouts. Students drop out of school. You set up an alternative school, often in a shopping mall or something like that, with online learning and teachers there playing this new role, and a lot of innovation happening there. But then you ask some of the districts and you say, well, how many students did you serve last year? They'll say, oh, we served 80 students. You say, well, how many graduated? You say, 100. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. You served 80 students, but 100 graduated? They're literally not counting unique students through the year, because the way policy works, it asks them to do the full count on the first Monday of October or something like that. And that's the only time they know. These students come in and out fluidly, and we have no idea. This is a real problem.
Yes.
Yes, one comment and one question. The comment is that the world is learning with Twitter as we sit here, and I wish the meeting would have started by telling us your Twitter names and also the hashtag for the meeting, because I'm tweeting with Aspen Institute, and it's probably not correct, so if anybody can inform us, that would be great. Because the world is learning with Twitter and with Facebook and with a lot of other things, and it will be great to share these great ideas. So we heard from Blair his passion and mission about creating this big infrastructure that will democratize and equalize, together with what Steve is doing, and it's definitely thinking system-wide, nationwide, worldwide. We hear from Michael Horn that mass customization, mass personalization is the big challenge, and it's really what this infrastructure and thinking like that, I think what's important from the outset. So before you do any innovation, I think if you think mass, you do different things than if you think a class, right? And I think that's what both of you are trying to do. And with Joel, well, and I know the idea since it started, and it's such a powerful idea, the School of One, I feel you're still in a class in building a model, and I wonder, what would you do to really, tomorrow morning, get up and say, okay, I figured it out. It's all about imagination, right? Not the resources. Let's take New York State, and how will you now design your infrastructure, your technology, your disruption, and your whole idea if you were tomorrow morning to be given a state? Because I think it's a very different kind of thinking. And I think that's the problem that we have, and I wonder if you can...
Can you give him a state other than New York?
No, because he's so connected in New York, and he knows exactly all the players.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest barrier to our doing School of One more broadly is a choice that we made to build our technology platform in a remarkably unscalable way. Right? Now, y'all are thinking, why in the world would you have done that to begin with? Well, we did that to begin with because most technology procurements in large organizations, and especially in education, here's what happens. The guy from procurement comes down, the lawyers come down and say, tell us exactly what you want so we can put it in the scope of work. So you have to say exactly what it is that you want. You fill out this form, right? And then it goes out to bid, and then everyone bids, oh, we can build this for you, no problem, and lots of money goes out the door. And then the first year, I changed my mind, I don't really want that. Oh, that's out of scope, sorry, I gotta change this, change that. And you spend a year fighting about what the it is. And you know what? You change your mind because you learn more, and this is one of the reasons, one of the barriers to innovation is like procurement processes. So we decided we weren't going to do that. We built School of One in an unscalable way because we didn't really know what it needed to do. And so teachers could come in and say, I hate this button, put it there, and the next day we could take that button and put it there. And after a year of doing this, now, today, we really now understand what the requirements are. We can now fill out that form pretty well. We got to start again to build it the right way. But I'm convinced that was a much better strategy to go about it than try to guess what that was.
So when are you starting the mass?
This fall.
She's very impatient
This fall.
here. When do you get it?
This fall, we will start the process, start building it again, basically. And our hope is that parts of it will be done by next fall, but certainly by the fall after that, we'll have scalable technology.
For statewide or nationwide?
Doesn't
Like
matter.
Facebook, like
Sure.
Twitter.
Exactly. Now, the technology is half of the challenge, and that's the easier half. The harder half is the implementation, the operations, making this fit into the DNA of how a school operates, and the schedule, and the people, and the roles, and we're learning a lot about what that's going to take too. But it is not magic. I mean, we'll do it in 3 schools this year. We're going to add 4 more next year, and we will figure it out. And once we sort of have that understanding, we have our technology, then we will begin to ramp up an infrastructure to enable that kind of scale.
Are you suggesting that model is either too slow, or you'd rather see something that is, you are?
Yes,
So say it.
because we do have a model called globaloria.org that actually, because we challenged ourselves from the outset, and Joel knows about it, and we said we're going state, that's the unit, we really structured it very differently, and we right away went to governors and superintendents of schools of a state, and the whole bottom-up, top-down had to work in a really different way to create the mass customization and to democratize, right, the way you think about a tool. Because I think we no longer can generate from one class today. And we have systems that are worldwide with 500 million users like Facebook to show us that it's possible.
It's interesting. It's interesting just because it very much seems it's not a technology problem or a technology risk. It's very much, though, a market risk or a system risk.
System risk.
There's just a quick story while someone thinks of their next question, but there's an entrepreneur in the Valley who 10 years ago or so was going to build this integrated system that was going to integrate with Yahoo Instant Messenger and AOL Instant Messenger and all these beautiful things. And they spent 6 months just coding intensely, and it was a beautiful system and so forth. And then he put up this gorgeous website and had a download now button, and they sat back and were saying people were going to flock to this thing and click download now, and no one did. And they sat there for a week, and no one ever clicked download now. And then he went back and he said, "Gosh, that's sort of depressing. How could I have learned that lesson earlier?" He said, "Well, we probably only had to do a month and a half of coding and put the website up." And then he had an even more depressing thought, which was he could have just put up a website with a little button and seen if the behavior was there at all. Yeah, and so you didn't have to do it. I think we have this mentality often that we have to sink a lot of upfront cost in something that we don't know whether it'll actually get adopted or what the systemic or market problems are. And that iteration, that fast iteration, I think is something that has not been familiar to schools, but really the technology does exist. That's not our problem. It's a systemic and market risk.
So along those lines, and I think this is relevant for all 3 of you, I know personally Blair was a sort of unsung master of opening a political umbrella under which we were allowed to work. And Department of Ed has done something similar for me in the work I'm doing now, where some of the work is a little bit crazy at the outset. It doesn't necessarily make sense, and either someone is going to get tense and push you off of that onto something that feels more like a normal paved road, or they're going to say, let's wait a little while and see, there's always going to be some reining in of the nutcases like myself. But But in the end, that dialectic or whatever is missing in a lot of public education. And Joel, I know that, at least in our conversations, that the initial difficulties in opening that umbrella, even 20 feet from the chancellor's office, you know, and so the question I have for all three of you, and in innovation, you know, both in disrupting class and earlier, you know, theories along those lines that Clay Christensen has put out, that, you know, they'll look at the little guy, and why does the little guy beat the big guy, right? And what can the big guy do to open up an umbrella that looks like a little guy inside himself to allow them to compete? So this is the question that I essentially have is, if we look at public education as a large apparatus, a highly federated but highly regulated and politically driven institution, what are some of the forces that you see that would allow us to open up these umbrellas, whether they're at the state level or at an individual classroom or somewhere in between, that could allow innovations either invented from the bottom or adopted from the side, or however they might come? But what are some of the forces that we can enable to get the political permission to undertake some of this within these highly structured, because the public schools aren't going away, and the school boards and the principals and superintendents who run them aren't going away, I don't think, anytime soon. So we're going to need to work within those apparatus to drive the change.
Well, I'll just make two very quick comments. First, I think part of the answer goes to what you were saying earlier, which is if you have what we might think of as common standards and common interfaces that allow people in discrete ways to do experimentation, that has a lot to do with it. And certainly you've seen that in the business community in various ways, and it'd be nice to do it in the public sector. But the harder thing, and you and I both know this through experience, is one of the thing that government does worst is experiment. Oddly, except for, of course, the Defense Department. Somehow they have a license to do a variety of things. You know, Linda and I met years ago when we were developing the E-rate, and I would say that the E-rate, going to Linda's point earlier, was in some sense an experiment that did a lot of good. In fact, put a lot of money into schools and connected everybody. But in another sense, it was a failure precisely for the reason Linda said, which is it wasn't system-wide. So simply connecting wasn't enough. We didn't have the political ability to use those funds for devices, for applications, for teachers training, et cetera. But it would have been early for it anyway. So, but I would love to just bring more. There should be more leadership like Arnie Duncan, essentially. You don't have to tell him I said this, but the point is, you really need some leaders to say what business leaders say, which is, you know, 5%, 10%, in some cases 20% of whatever it is we're doing has to be about R&D, has to be about experimentation. We have to be willing to accept failure. And I have to tell you, in this particular political context that we're in right now, people do not want to do anything that risks failure. And it's a really horrible thing, and it's really awful, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. But that is you just have to have a certain kind of, in some sense, I think actually the business leaders have to step up and say, we need to give people room to fail, because that's how you actually learn. We do it all the time. We need the government to do it too.
I couldn't agree more with that. I also think one resource that we have that is not leveraged in this regard that could be is summer school. I mean, this is a time where you have a lot of kids who wouldn't otherwise be in school. You have a lot more flexibility in terms of the people side. Parents don't have sort of necessarily a huge expectation for what happens in the summer. We have this sort of time period where we can really commission the experimentation of radically different school models and rigorously measure the results and ultimately look at after school or other sectors. So I would sort of, there's always a risk of, experimentation on one hand, and you're experimenting on whose children are you experimenting on the other hand, and people aren't so comfortable with that word when it comes to education. But summer, I think, provides a really interesting opportunity to explore that. So
I think one of the big challenges that just jumped out was in those systems, and Blair, you wrote about this in your Washington Post piece that I thought was really, really quite eloquent, which is that in systems where there is full consumption, it's awfully hard to have a disruptive player come out. Clay's models of disruptive innovation work really, really well where there's literally nothing. And there are a segment of people not being served, and yet we have a schooling system that's largely compulsory and therefore serves everyone. So if you actually look where the biggest innovation is coming is from abroad in developing countries that are desperate, and their mobile devices, yeah, they're not very good for certain things, but gosh, they're a whole lot better than nothing, which is what I had yesterday. So that's a challenge. I think one of the reasons the book is called Disrupting Class and not Disrupting Schools is if you look at the classroom level, or the level of courses might be more accurate, you actually see lots of non-consumption. And so those are more politically protected places where you can do this experimentation because there wasn't anything there before. And so summer school, I think, is a great example of that. I'll list 10 off my head right now. Summer school, tutoring, credit recovery, unit recovery, advanced courses, which means AP, but also 25% of our high schools do not offer chemistry or physics. 25% of our high schools do not offer anything above geometry. 25% of our high schools don't offer an honors English class. Their language classes are another big one, especially if you start thinking about the elementary model as well, where we know we learn language
Computer
better.
science.
So you could go on and on. So I think if you start looking there, you see some of the protected space. But then you ask the second question, which is, well, it's sort of the incumbent doing this disruptive innovation, which historically hasn't worked out that well. So the couple times we've seen incumbents be able to disrupt themselves, in the case of IBM is one that's done it. They were the leader in the mainframes. They were also an early leader in personal computers. The way they did it was they set up an entirely autonomous division. They were headquartered in New York. The personal computer division was in Florida. Totally different sales force assumptions. And they basically just said, we don't know how to sell a personal computer, but you guys just figure out whatever it takes to do it. And they did it rather successfully until they were disrupted themselves. The other place we saw it was department stores, largely disrupted by discount retail over the last 50 years. Kmart, Walmart, and Target have disrupted. There used to be 300 plus department store chains. There's now like 7 or 8. One department store made the transition. Dayton Hudson, that set up this little autonomous division called Target. Said, do whatever you got to do, even if it cannibalizes what we do today, that's okay. That takes real leadership to be able to set up that autonomous zones. So I guess the biggest thing I'd say is take that autonomy around those areas of non-consumption and fiercely protect them and say, let's get rid of the old assumptions, student-teacher ratios, what else? Teacher certification rules so that we can start leveraging teachers from all over the country. These seat time metrics. Take all of these input-laden things and just ask for, let's focus on the outcomes and really drive experimentation in that environment. I think that's the richest area we can do it. What I think has held us back is that we've stripped maybe a couple of those input-laden barriers out of the non-consumption, not all of them, and not put in enough of the outcome thing to really focus on what problem we're actually trying to solve.
I'm liking this. I'm thinking I'm going to get maybe dessert served every night on the set of the NewsHour. Very. Thank you. Just to come back to something we were talking about earlier, is cost a selling point when you're trying to answer some of these questions, or something you don't want to talk about, or something you do want to talk about?
I think it's something you want to talk about. I think the best disruptive innovations are those that are lower cost, that enable people that were too costly to be able to take on these things. Some of the disruptive innovations we've seen, on the one hand, are not more cost effective, but on the other hand, are actually extremely so because they start to aggregate students across different districts and things like that and extend convenience and affordability in a way we haven't seen before. And the imperative, as the department knows, is going to be doing more with less. It's just the reality in which we're living right now. And that should be a great time to fuel disruptive innovations. It's where we see the biggest boom in other sectors.
Can I just say that very quickly that I'm about to demonstrate my great ignorance of education by saying the following. Every conference I've been to, everyone always says the best investment we make is in teachers. Right? And I'm going to say the heretical, but I believe true. The best investments you make are things that rights Moore's law.
The what?
The things that ride Moore's law. Okay. In the tech conferences, everyone would know what I mean. So Moore's law comes out of Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, who said that, I'm not sure I get the math right, but that the cost of the chip will go down in half every 2 years. And so what you see, the reason why the original iPod could hold 200 phones, and we thought it was very cool, and now it holds 2,000, is because the same chip at the same price can now do infinite order of magnitude. And what you have throughout the broadband ecosystem is devices are writing Moore's law, Spectrum is writing Moore's law, all kinds of things that used to cost huge amounts of money now don't cost as much, which is why, in a lot of ways, this stuff is now possible. I mean, I think the iPad or the Kindle opened people's minds, but that's nothing compared to what you're going to see in about a year. Because the third generation, the second generation of the iPad comes out in December, the third generation, particularly when you put it on a 4G platform, which we don't really have yet in this country, but we will in a few years. Those are the things that really, that's what we ought to be investing into, because the massive nature of the improvements will really, it will scale and therefore improve.
Yes.
I'm Lisa Molyneux with the House Appropriations Committee. So I guess, obviously I'm coming at this from the perspective of federal funding, and I'm curious to know what role you see, if any, for the federal government to play in subsidizing this type of activity, especially if we're going to talk about sort of independent entities that are held separate and going outside of the current, the incumbency. I'm not sure it's clear. Obviously, the federal government has tried to throw money out there through investing in innovation, $650 million, education technology grants in the Recovery Act. I think a $650 million infusion we put in there. I'm curious to know if you feel like there are opportunities in either one of those programs or other programs that can actually play a role here. Does there need to be a different generation of federal programs? Or is this something that really just by the very definition of what you're talking about, customization, is this something that the federal government really should be sitting out of or removing barriers in some way, but not, or helping to remove barriers, but not actually devoting resources to, because there's not really an appropriate way to do that? I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm happy to leave the room if you want.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in. Okay. For someone that gets labeled with the education technology crew, I probably have a counterintuitive answer, which is I think I wouldn't put more earmarks on funds for technology per se, but I would strip away more barriers and focus on that to give more flexibility to districts in how they spend scarce dollars, such that they can make those smart decisions to achieve the accountability aims that you're setting up.
But given that the federal government is only contributing a very small piece of what's spent in schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, does that really leverage enough? I mean, if we're just going to say, do whatever you want with your Title I money, you don't have to spend it exactly the, it's still just a small percentage.
Well,
is that enough? Or
So I have a slightly different answer, which, I mean, we were lucky enough to be awarded an I-3 grant, and it is a lifeline. I thought it was a terrific, I mean, we won, obviously I'm a little bit biased, but it was a terrific program, a terrific idea, and I think it's something that sort of paves the way for people who are trying to think differently. It's top cover, it's financial resources, it's districts competing, it's creating the conditions for this to be successful, and providing some ammunition for people that are doing the kind of things that I'm doing to push the envelope and to see what can be done. So I couldn't agree more. I think some of the other federal revenue streams can also be useful, but what oftentimes happens is by the time they get their way down to a school, you got to only spend it in these 4 schools, and you got to spend it on this and on that, and the 27 forms. And I mean, there's a lot of improvisation that goes into this at this particular stage of development. And so, the more unrestricted, I mean, I think ultimately I think about organizations like Teach for America and the New Teacher Project. Those were great organizations that their success fueled policy changes. And I think for us to get to this next level, I think that we're going to have to bet on some organizations that some will work out and some will not, but can really push the envelope with some unrestricted funds. And some will be successful and some will not. But I think collectively, it's tough to see where the resources will come to do that if they don't come from governmental sources, maybe philanthropic to some degree.
So in looking at the I3 program,
Yeah.
The amount of money that's available for totally untested initiatives, the development grants, is just $5 million.
Yeah.
Is that a sufficient, so a program that's brand new, like what you came up with, and we're lucky enough to have the chancellor 20 feet away, but you had nothing to show, you had no evidence yet.
Yeah.
Under that scenario where it's a pure experiment, is $5 million a sufficient grant for an activity like that? Because in order to get more money, obviously you've got to already have some evidence in place to get a validation or a scale.
Well, we thought we had to have some evidence even for the $5 million. That it couldn't just be back of a napkin, I have an idea, give me $5 million. If it were, I would say yes, $5 million actually does seem more than generous for a back of the napkin idea if you can show the right capacity and the right idea. We had a little bit more than that, and we didn't have it to the level of the 30 million or the 50 million, so we had to stay at 5. So I would look to the evidence levels for that rather than is 5 million enough.
I love actually the criteria of Blair of maybe more federal funding to those ideas or projects that have some evidence but need to get more evidence if and only if they ride this more law. I think the categories for who won and how people won the I3 needs to be exponentially revised to create a nationwide transformation.
I guess the concern with removing barriers is, in our current budget situation, the sort of foundational money that goes out the door right now, which sort of keeps the lights on in most buildings, if you take some money out of that in order even just to devote 10%, that 10% might really be felt by the schools or the particular students that aren't part of the 10% project. And there's no room right now in the federal budget to try and fill in that 10% while also growing, a separate sort of innovate. So that I just think realistically, if we're going to be realistic about the political climate, I think that's a major, major problem. It's very hard to talk about shifting funds to a more flexible use when folks feel like they need every dollar of the foundational use right now. In some places, that's the problem, is we've got the federal government trying to cover everybody, and we've got folks in different states and districts in very different situations.
So I don't want to dominate, but everybody saw the social network, and you saw how little money versus 640 million.
I'm trying to conference an appropriations bill. I have not seen the social
okay.
network.
How little money?
I wish I had seen this.
How little money was needed when you'll see it to reach so many hundreds of thousands of people with innovation? I think people just need to put it in perspective of what's happening in the real world.
Can I be unrealistic for a second about the political situation, which I find to be much more fun? November's going to be, I'm not making a partisan point. It's going to be extremely bloody. Then what happens, and I happen to be working at the FCC in '94, which was really bloody. So what happens is then for 6 months, there's a lot of interpretation of the meaning of that thing that just occurred, where both sides say, this, that, phase, tax cutting, blah, blah, blah. Then people start to wake up and go, well, what is the thing that we could actually do that is consistent with kind of where there's an intersect? So you actually got a telecom bill, you actually got a balanced budget, you got a welfare reform. So we're going to have that. And I would say to you, I have at various places said, it's very simple. We need to replace every textbook with an e-book. This is ridiculous. It's a better platform. It's a learning platform. It's the way everything that wants to innovate and grow is going to do. This is something on which I think both Democrats and Republicans entirely agree. The most conservative people I know say they completely agree. There's a wide group of people who would totally. This is an agenda item where I think you actually could grow a budget, but I think it has to be framed in the sense of experimentation. And I realize I'm being completely unrealistic, but my point is, just in the same way that certain districts are doing this, because in truth, the cost of the devices is going to be cheaper than a single textbook in the not too distant future. This is something which, if you look out, not where we are today, but where we're going to be 6 months from now, a year from now, this is a great issue to start to drive a different kind of consensus. about change, because, you know, 2 years ago we had an administration come in talking about change. Whatever happens in this election, people are going to be talking about change. This is change.
I think there's a lot of consensus out there about things we should be doing differently and investments we should be making in education, and I don't think that there's any partisanship there. The problem is...
Well, there's plenty of partisanship, but now you're being...
Well, but I think there's lots of areas where there's not partisanship.
Yeah, right.
But the problem is when it comes time to actually support a piece of legislation that spends money, and you're talking about a top-line piece of legislation...
That's why I said I was being...
Right, then you have political things that get, even though you've got lots of members who are going to be supporting the individual pieces within the legislation, they won't vote to spend the money necessary for it, and so.
Can I ask a question of you guys that's very relevant to Lisa's terrific question? Is there a way within the existing programs, I mean, you know, when we were doing the new tech plan, we looked at Title I, we looked at special education. And what was very striking to us was that those programs are already becoming increasingly dependent upon technology. But those programs themselves have no support for technology. In fact, there are state Title I directors who go around saying you can't spend any money on technology with Title I. So is there a way to open up the opportunity for school districts and states to be far more transformative than they are with the existing support for those, what I would describe as the baseline programs? They're not going to go away. I mean, do you have any ideas that would be practical that Lisa could take back and put into the legislation?
That's my perspective. That aligns with my perspective, is that we're not actually... Most of these, because the budget crunches are taking away, this is what's causing the innovation, so it's not a question of more dollars that's needed. I think this is also unique in that way. But I do think it's being able to use the dollars that exist to be able to put toward these programs that aren't right now. So whether it's guidelines that suggest this is okay, whether it's tying it to the other contention I would make, the only way we're going to realize the goals that we want to of educating every child is by using this technology and riding this wave. And so if you set outcomes that you want to see with data around it that you want to see, which does drive policy and does drive action, you're going to move the needle on this in ways that has to happen. And if they have to keep the lights on with the dollars, they're not going to get to the outcomes either, so they won't misuse it. Well, I would be more focused, I guess, on creating the conditions for innovation and create the conditions for success rather than trying to worry about every single misuse that's out there, because it's going to happen either way. So better to create the opportunities for innovation is how I would think about it.
Yes.
I just wanted to, can I just follow that?
Oh, okay.
A very brief response regarding something I don't get to talk a lot about, probably for good reason, which is the actual education policy that Arnie puts out there, just because of the kind of work that I do. But the ESEA reauthorization proposal specifically integrates the technology expenditures in line with the programmatic expenditures. And I mean, I've worked in school districts where I've seen a technology discussion with the ETT happening in a room 3 doors down from the other discussion, right? The policy, what textbook, what curriculum, what training, and there's nobody in common in the 2 rooms, and then they go back and they run their reports and file their, you know, and you wonder why technology isn't integrated effectively. So I just want to point out that the Department of Education has put forward a platform to say, when we spend these monies, we should spend them in an integrated manner so that you can't have state directors and other people saying you cannot expend these special ed monies to support special ed students with technology, which is crazy, right? I mean, I think it's crazy. And the Department of Education is at least advocating for that in the current ESEA reauthorization proposal.
Okay. Oh, you, well.
My name's Pat Alper. One of the roles I play is I'm on the national board for the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, which I'm very impassioned by. The first thing I want to say is thank you to Carlos, I can't read your last name, for hosting this, putting this on, and for the innovation that you are doing in bringing this to the forefront. And I'd be curious from you and also from Lisa, is what do you think the role is for business, the business sector, and maybe leveraging business to incentivize them to be involved in the schools and bring some of their brain power, their mentoring power, and their financial power in their own regions? Just seems like
I'm glad you asked that. I was going to try to put Carlos on the spot at the end here, but now there you go.
So, we're a little bit unique. We have, in the U.S., we have about 45,000 employees. We have some very large manufacturing facilities, and we're able to use all our resources. So we're able to send engineers to the classroom. We have an incentive program where our foundation matches for every hour that a person volunteers at a school. They get $10. And in addition to that, what I talked about is we believe in STEM education. We invest heavily in STEM education. Our former chairman is chair of Change the Equation, the STEM initiative that the president launched a couple weeks ago. And so our role, I think, is combining the talents of our resources of everything from people that want to go in and help teach kids how to do math formulas, to questions about technology, to professional development, and celebrating for us. It's also we want to celebrate our students that are innovative. So our science talent search, our science fairs, because I think that really shines the light on what we want as this country, and a lot of kids get attention, which is good for athletics, and that's good. But we should also be celebrating the kids that are going to lead us to the next great product or the next great invention that's out there.
Well, just what you're doing is taking a real leadership role for business in America, and if there was more of that, it would stem down into. So I applaud you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a different question about business because I'm Susan Sclafani with the National Center on Education and the Economy, and I'm just saying I taught my first computer literacy class in 1971. Been in this a long time and really hoped it was going to move a lot faster than it's moved. But one of the questions that I had when we talk about having e-books for kids, at the moment, if I bought a textbook online, I would be charged the same thing I would be charged if I bought it in hardcover. So how are we going to create the incentives or the collaboration to get the textbook business, the instructional resource business, aligned to a new view of what education can be, so that we can have them working with us rather than against us? I mean, I've seen the battles with McGraw-Hill or the other publishers of regular books about what the price of a book and novels should be on the e-book. How do we, and that's small potatoes compared to the cost of textbooks. So how do we start changing that conversation so that we can help the publishers see that there is a new world coming, that they can make money in that new world, but they've got to make it differently?
Price fixing action by the Attorney General, Antitrust Division. Is this public? I shouldn't have said that. No,
Yes, it is.
I'm not an antitrust lawyer, so I was just making that up. Look, I think that Michael actually probably knows this better because that's actually the area. At the end of the day, those guys will have to decide whether to have a strategy to lead the revolution or to, and it will be a revolution, or to essentially try to make today last as long as possible. So, just there's a variety of different tactics and strategies and leverage points. But various states are doing certain things with open source. There will be certain kind of breakthrough moments that occur, and when that happens, they won't be able to keep the price the same. Basically, is what it's going to work.
Can I make a note about the price? We shouldn't assume that textbooks online should be cheaper, because in many ways they can be better, customizable, with more features and interactivity, which can also make them more expensive. because they are customizable, upgradable, and multilingual, multicultural, and they have all these amazing features that actually, the concept of like doing the same but digital should actually not be part of a conversation on innovation.
Right, but I still think when you talk about the numbers that can be reached using the technologies, that they might make less money at the beginning, but in the long run, they'll make a lot more money, even if the price is somewhat lower.
It's interesting to think about what goes into the cost equation and it's this whole business model right around it with this infrastructure of editors and designers and all and salespeople and all these things. And so it's awfully hard to go to those players in their existing division and say, well, you've just launched it for, this thing is basically the marginal cost is zero. Why aren't you selling it for zero? Because they don't see it that way from their business models, which is why I think we're having this clash. And I'm going to be careful because my book is published by McGraw-Hill. Pessimistically, but I think realistically, it's hard to expect that they will be the ones out front. Again, as I said at the beginning, in theory, they have the resources to do it. They really have to do what Dayton Hudson and IBM did and set up an autonomous division freed from all those assumptions about what quality is and how a book gets made to even think about what that might look like. I guess the other part of it is, and I asked Joel about this, I sometimes wonder if talking about textbooks also leads us astray. And
in what way?
I don't know if A, the future will be in textbooks, as that implies, and B, I don't know that it asks the right question about actually changing the system into one focused around the child.
I completely think that's right. I mean, if in a model we're trying to teach kids a skill, maybe a chapter out of a textbook is the right way, maybe a field trip is the right way, maybe finding their own thing online is the right way. So we have to just think broadly about instructional materials from wherever they may come and use data to determine what is the most effective. And I think because, one of the big advantages that publishers have today is the distribution. Like they just have a lock on 15,000 school districts. When those barriers come down, when mom and pop have a great fractions lesson, if that can actually get tested toe to toe against something developed from a publisher, and we can actually see what's more effective, I think they're not going to have a choice but to sort of come around to a new.
But you don't still need a market to create some of that substance. It's wherever you want to, whatever you're going to turn to, you got to turn to something.
Sure. In our world, we have 50 different content providers, and if one says we don't want to do it anymore, we've got 49 more and a few more knocking on the door. So our hope is to continue to build that bank.
I do think actually, Blair, you've written about this. The big surprise of the iPod, or excuse me, the iPhone wasn't the iPhone per se, but was the marketplace that it seeded.
Right.
And that platform for that marketplace, that network, I think that's going to be the big breakthrough that we ultimately see. There are a number of organizations trying it. Steve and I were at a conference with a couple of them who are trying it. There are a number of organizations taking baby steps in this way, but whoever puts out that network that can make money, where I think the dollars are going to shift. Look, I think content is largely going to become a commodity, where the dollars will shift to the assessment and data part of it. And there'll be 20% of content that's still really important to invest in, simulations, gameplay, stuff like that. But I think you're going to see that big change come about.
Let's see, I want to go to that side of the room now. Oh, two of you, please start.
My name's Jenny Niles, and I'm head of school at E.L. Haynes Public Charter School. So I have so many questions, but I'm going to try and narrow it down to just one. One of the things is we are moving to a very data-rich environment and building a platform for kids to see their data. And you touched on this a little bit, Joel, but I think that I'd love for you all to reflect on this, especially Michael, because I feel like we're K-8, pre-K-8, and we're just about to start our high school. But this also is going to be a disruptive technology, is to actually give the kids, because in doing what you're doing, Joel, and what we're finding is that we have to explicate exactly to them what they're supposed to learn, and then that gives them the ownership over it in ways that they've never had before. And so I'd love to also know who you're looking towards and who else is thinking about this, because we see this as this incredible opportunity, and we don't know quite exactly how to harness it.
I'll tell you in our field interviews with these online learning providers, one of the biggest things, excuse me, not with the providers, with the students who are taking the courses from the providers, one of the biggest things that they say is ownership is the biggest reason that they get really excited about it. And it reverses one of the other assumptions on its head, which is we don't tell the child at the beginning of the year where they're going or what success looks like. That seems crazy when you think about it. And it's so that those couple shifts. And so a lot of the online providers, be it Apex Learning, Florida Virtual, K-12 Inc., et cetera, that's one of the big things that they see as well as driving some of the shift. But
Totally agree. I want to add to that in a bit of a circuitous way a story. In my previous job at the department, I oversaw HR. And there was a woman in HR that she knew how to deal with maternity leave. And if you were going on maternity leave, you better get her on the phone, because if anyone else told you anything, it was probably wrong information. And her voicemail box would fill up, and she would be out on vacation, and no one got good information. So we started this process to create a call center where every employee could call. And to do that, you had to pull out all the information from all these folks that work at the department on how things are done. So you sit down with the maternity leave lady, like, okay, how does it work? What's the form? You pull all this information out, and then put it online so that now anybody can call the call center, get the same information, or go online and get the same information. I say all this to say that the technology forced a level of discipline in our core organization that had incredibly important ramifications, because it has to in order for it to work. And what I think we're going to see, in your question, and Michael's comment sort of reminds me of this, is if we move to online learning and student tracking of results, that requires a definition of what competency means. Mm-hmm. And if we have a definition of what competency means, guess what? That applies to teachers just as much as it applies to the online learners. And so it's going to force us to sort of, the key to customization and standardization in many ways. And I think it's going to be a very healthy process for schools to ask these precise questions of what do we mean by success. It's going to force everyone to be work in a more coherent way.
yeah, that is actually one point. Standards are critical to getting customization. Yeah.
Is this what you're worried about, the sort of nuts and bolts of making the shift, or the larger will it work?
No, I know it's going to work.
Uh-huh.
We're definitely going to do it. It's more of continuing to find folks to talk about what doors is this going to open that we can't even see. We can sense the power of it, and so it's folks who are ahead of the game, ahead of us, and seeing what they've seen and say, oh my gosh, I didn't even know this was possible in this very much sort of experimental or innovative frame.
I'll give you one little one. So in our program, we found there are kids who love to try something themselves before they have a teacher explain it. Other kids who won't even think about touching anything until a teacher explains it. And they're two totally different. You probably pull here, it would be 50-50. We've created something in our model called Prove It assessments, which is to say, if you think you know how to add fractions, you have any issue, prove it. Here's an assessment, and if you do it and do it well, you can move on to the next one. So you can move much more efficiently. And I think creating those opportunities for kids to try things on their own and challenge them to challenging them to teach themselves something, I think will not only accelerate their growth, but will free up the teachers to focus more with the kids who are struggling.
If I could just, something, I think it was Steve who told me this, and this is when my eyes started to open when we were doing the broadband plan. Kid reading a textbook today doesn't understand. What do? There's nothing. They have no option. But maybe